And waiting for the little ding. There we go. There's the little ding. Yeah, I kind of meant to take a little bit more time on the digeneans, but we're going to kind of squish all of them into one, I'm afraid. We talked about the Strigeiforms, which include schistosoma, globally one of the bigger public health problems. The other three are Echinostomatoforms, Opisthoraciforms, and Plagiorciforms. Echinostomatoforms means they've got spiny mouths. Opisthoraciforms means testicles in the rear. Plagiorciforms, I'm afraid I would have to look up plagio. I'm kind of drawing a blank this morning. But Echinostomatoforms often have scales or spines on the tegument. Some of them have scales or spines around the anterior sucker. That's what Echinostomatoforms means, spiny mouth. Usually the ventral sucker is pretty close to the mouth, and they're both kind of up at the front. You might remember that there's some flukes, amphistome flukes, where the ventral sucker is way back at the posterior end. But in these, the ventral sucker is usually anterior. Echinostomatid flukes are pretty widespread as wildlife parasites. There are some species that infect humans, mostly in Asia, as far as I know. Fasciola, you've already had a belly full, well, not literally. I hope you haven't really had a belly full of fasciola, but that's the sheep liver fluke. That's the one that by now you've all seen in lab. And then an oddball family called Cathiamazids includes Riboroia ondatri, which turns out to be responsible for the plague of deformed frogs that we started seeing back in the 1990s. So there's those spines around the mouth of an echinostomatid. This one's echinostoma. You can see the spines forming a collar around the mouth, the circumoral collar. And then human infection is endemic to Eastern and Southeastern Asia. I'm not aware of any that would commonly infect people elsewhere. The species are not particularly strongly host-specific. They can infect the livers and intestines of many mammals, although the main definitive host in the wild is snail-eating birds. And you can see the basic life cycle here. Eggs pass in feces. Eggs hatch into myricydia, penetrate the snails, do the whole sporocyst redia-cercaria thing. The cercaria invade the second intermediate host and form metacercaria. And in picture B, down there at the lower right, you can see what a metacercaria of echinostoma looks like. They can form metacercaria inside snails, or they might leave the snail and form a metacercaria inside a different intermediate host, like a clam, a fish, or a frog. Eat any of those raw or undercooked, and you can get the parasite from eating metacercariae. So there's an adult echinostoma in full over there on the right. That's picture C. And then A, up at the top left, you've got one of the snail hosts. That's what live fasciola looks like. You've seen these all, but they were pretty brightly stained red. But there's one that's been freshly removed. Adults live in livestock bile ducts, causes liver damage if the bile ducts get blocked. An estimated 2 million people worldwide get infected with this. And again, usually it's by eating contaminated water plants. The examples that I'm aware of are eating watercress, which, if it's grown in habitat where there's snails and livestock downstream, can get infected with metacercaria. And we've kind of beaten this life cycle to death, so I won't say too much more about it. But there it is yet again. And then Riboroia ondatri develops in ram's horn snails. That's just a particular group of snails that are coiled in a particular way. They leave the snails as cercariae, and the metacercaria form in larval amphibians, tadpoles. Those get eaten by the definitive host. Usually that's a frog-eating bird, such as a heron. Although ondatri means belonging to otters, so these might be able to live in mammals as well, just judging by which you can't always do, judging by the Latin name. That's a cercaria, of course, kind of a frightening looking thing. And it's even more frightening what these will do to frogs, because the metacercaria like to form in the limb buds of a tadpole. And if you disrupt the cell arrangement of those developing limb buds, if you do anything physically to them, they can split or otherwise start growing in unusual ways. So there you've got a mature frog that had the development of its right hind leg interfered with by a metacercaria of Riboroia ondatri. So yeah, that's just a little bit frightening looking right there. It's more common in eutrophied water, and you might remember that eutrophication is what you call it when you have excess nutrient input to a body of fresh water. If you have a lot of fertilizer, it could be, livestock manure, it could be the fertilizer on your farm fields running off in the rain. When you input a lot of fertilizer to water, it causes a situation called eutrophication. And what you usually see is a great big overgrowth of algae. If you've ever seen a pond that was just completely green, that could be a result of eutrophication. And eutrophication tends to favor Riboroia, and herbicides, notably one called atrazine. Atrazine can not only do funny things to a frog's and potentially other organisms' endocrine system, as documented by one of my partners in crime and friends in grad school, who has now gone on to a terrific career, a guy named Tyrone Harris at Berkeley. He documented that. But atrazine not only messes with frog endocrine systems, it weakens the immune systems and increases the severity of the infection. So you have a greater incidence of frogs with horrifying limb deformities in areas with a lot of agricultural runoff, which makes me think I clearly should have taken those water samples, not from Lake Conway, but from some, I don't know, maybe a rice field outside of Stuttgart. Might have had much better luck. One of these days I'll do that. I should try that. Right, so much for Riboroia. Plagiorchiformes, there's often a piercing mouth part, and you'll see this term again if an animal's mouth has a single, needle-like structure that's used for piercing. It's generally called a stylet. So cercaria often have stylets. The tail is not forked, but it typically has a dorsal fin. And in most species, eggs are fairly small, and instead of the Myrissidia hatching and penetrating the snail just eats the eggs. And this includes the lancet liver fluke, which is a major livestock parasite. And it includes a genus Paragonimus that parasitizes humans and carnivorous mammals and is a public health concern in some parts of the world. So there's the lancet liver fluke. Intermediate host is a snail, And the cercaria leave the snail and penetrate into ants. When the ants are accidentally eaten by grazing livestock, the metacercaria pop out and the livestock get parasitized. Those pinkish things towards the front are the testes. All of the brown branching stuff that you're seeing, that's all going to be ovary and uterus. And then to the left and the right, faintly staining, you can see those yolk glands, the vitellaria. And I think I've shown you this slide before, but dicrocelium insists on the brain of an ant. The cercaria will come out of a snail, penetrate an ant, and form metacercaria on the brain, and cause the ant to crawl up to the tip of a grass blade, lock its jaws onto the tip of the grass, and just sit there, which increases the odds that it will get eaten by a grazing sheep or goat. So great case here of parasites that are able to engineer host behavior in order to favor their own transmission. This is not the first time and not the last that we've seen this theme. It's one of the more horrifying things that parasites can do. And then Paragonimus includes at least 9 species that can infect humans, and the best known is the Asian lung fluke, Paragonimus westermani. Unlike most of the flukes that we've seen, it's not a gut parasite, it's a lung parasite. You get it by eating raw or undercooked crustaceans that contain infective metacercaria. Those hatch in your duodenum. That's the part of your small intestine just downstream from your stomach. The juveniles burrow out of your duodenum and manage to travel to the lungs. Don't know how they know how to go there. That's kind of an interesting question as to how parasites know how to navigate within the host body. But a common vector is Ericaire sinensis. This is the Chinese mitten crab. It is, I believe this one's actually fairly recently been introduced to California, and it's causing some ecological problems there, like many introduced species do. And it is common in some areas to eat it either raw or fairly lightly cooked. And if you eat it raw or lightly cooked, the muscle may be filled with metacercaria. These are the metacercaria of 6 different species of Paragonimus. They were all collected from freshwater crustaceans, in this case in Vietnam. And C at the top right is Paragonimus westermani. And you can see these vary quite a bit in size. But yeah, eat Chinese mitten crab without cooking it thoroughly. The metacercaria will hatch in your small intestine, bore out, and travel their way to your lungs. And this is what the adults look like in a biopsy. That's a thin section through somebody's lung. Now, when your lung gets infected, what the body will try to do is seal off the infection so that it can't spread. This is what happens in tuberculosis, for example. Your body tries to wall off the foci of infection, and you get these nodules inside your lungs. You get similar nodules if you get infected with Asian lung flukes. Those nodules can actually block the smaller air passages in your lungs, the bronchioles. Long-term infection can look like TB for the same reason. Your body's making nodules in your lungs, and long-term infection can last up to 20 years. The adults lay eggs, and you cough the eggs up, and that's what the eggs look like. That might either be spread by being coughed up and then spit out, or if you cough up these things and swallow your phlegm, the eggs may pass out in the feces. And that's what the eggs look like right there. This may not seem like that big a deal, but there's an estimated 20 million people worldwide that have been infected with paragonimus. And one of the unfortunate consequences of some parasite infections is if the parasite has to wander within the body, if it has to migrate from point A to point B, it can end up wandering to the wrong place. Although I guess there is no real right place, but it can end up traveling to places where you really don't want any parasites at all, notably your brain. We've seen this before with a particular roundworm that you can get from raccoon feces, Balis ascaris. We'll see this again when we look at tapeworms next week. And there are other examples of this. If there's a parasite in your body that is supposed to migrate and it migrates to the wrong spot, you can end up with very severe medical complications from that. So wayward lung flukes, if they enter the brain, you get neurological symptoms like seizures, headache, ultimately death if you don't get that treated. So please always cook your mitten crab. One of the big take-home lessons that I do try to convey in this course is cook your food adequately. That will actually protect you from a sizable amount of the parasites that you might get exposed to is cooking. Okay, this is going a little faster than I thought it would, but the Opisthorchiformes is that last group. Testes at the posterior end of the adult is what that means. Opistho means posterior. Opisthorchidae includes the Chinese liver fluke. And then Heterophyidae includes more species that can parasitize humans. So what the heck? Here's the Chinese liver fluke. Estimated 30 million people worldwide are infected with the Chinese liver fluke, which can not only damage your liver, but infection increases the risk of liver and bile duct cancer. This would probably be true for the other flukes as well. I think anything, if you think about it, cancer is caused by an error in cell division. So anything that causes damage to cells and requires your cells to divide more to repair damage is going to increase the odds of cancer. That's why smoking and drinking together gives you a higher risk of throat cancer than either one alone. The combined irritation of tar and nicotine from your cigarettes and the alcohol kills a lot of your mouth epithelial cells or your throat epithelium. Those cells have to be replaced, so you go through a lot more cell divisions. And the more times those cells have to divide, the greater the odds that one of them is going to have exactly the wrong mutation in it. I assume this is the same thing here, that if you damage the liver can repair its damage, but the more times liver cells have to divide, the greater the odds are that one of them is just going to happen to have a mutation in the wrong place, in one of those oncogenes that causes it to turn cancerous. So how do you get this? You get this by eating metacercaria in the flesh or the skin of freshwater fish, notably carp. And you can see they come out in the duodenum, they colonize the bile duct, eggs pass out in the feces, the eggs get eaten by snails, and you get Myristidia, Sporosis, Radiocercaria, etc. The cercaria come out and form metacercaria in the skin or the flesh of freshwater fish. So should be very familiar to you by now. Lab for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking for metacercaria in freshwater fish. This, by the way, is a closely related species, Opisthothorchus felinius, the so-called cat liver fluke. I have not heard of this showing up in domestic cats. I actually asked a couple of past students in this course who were doing internships in local veterinary clinics, and they'd never heard of it. So as far as I know, it is at least rare in domestic cats here, although it may be more common in Asian cats, maybe in Asian wild species. Opisthothorchus viverini. Viverini means that it would be the usual definitive host would be weasels or mongoose or something like that. But these are capable of parasitizing humans as well. And this slide, you can see the anatomy really nicely. You can see those two branches of the gut going almost all the way to the posterior end. The mouth's at the left. At the posterior end, you've got two pretty compact testes in the rear. Most of the brown branchy stuff in the middle is going to be ovaries and uterus. And then at top and bottom of the picture, or on the left and the right of the actual organism, you can see those vitellaria really clearly, those yolk glands. And then another one that can, smallest flukes out there, you can from eating fish with encysted metastasia. Heavy infections will cause just general gastrointestinal system symptoms, diarrhea and such. Related one, metagonymus, you also get from eating raw or undercooked freshwater fish. This is another one that's primarily found in Asia. And this is another one where you can get very severe symptoms if adults find their way into the heart or the brain, where you really don't want them. The last one I'll mention, Apophallus, the metacercaria here are in salmon. That's some salmon muscle right there. They can kill farmed salmon. That's another problem that salmon can cause. The definitive host is a loon, but metacercaria can parasitize a pretty wide range of vertebrates, including humans, although usually they don't cause symptoms. I tell you guys what, that went by faster than I thought it was gonna. So how about I go ahead and pull out the next presentation and get us started on that. I'm going to flap my gums at you for about 20 minutes more, just because we have the time, and I want to make sure we don't fall too far behind. We're already behind where I wanted to be because of that missed day. So if you give me a moment, I'll pull up the next slides, and I'll introduce monogeneans. If anybody's got any questions real quick, I will go ahead and entertain them. Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming up on the chat. Not hearing from anybody. Let me see. You heard about the lady in the butcher shop who accidentally backed into the meat grinder? Disaster. Okay, get it. I'll type it in the chat. Okay. Question, how long do tests usually take to get graded? I'm going to lock myself in my house with a bottle of scotch and get you guys done on Monday. Yeah, it'll take me the weekend, but I'll get some feedback as, you know, As soon as I can, sooner than I usually do. I don't have anything going on this weekend. Right. Carrying on. We'll pick up with tapeworms on Monday, but in the time that we've got, we'll cover monogeneans. We've already talked about trematoda, the flukes or the digenea, and then the aspidobothria are those weird things with shields on their bellies. Circumeromorpha is monogeneans, and cestoidea includes the true tapeworms plus a couple of other things. And monogeneans don't parasitize humans. They don't parasitize most species of veterinary importance. Although one of you, I forget who, was interested in zoo animal veterinary practice. And so I'll tell you, there is one species that is a parasite inside hippopotamus eye sockets. There are some that will parasitize amphibians and reptiles, but where they intersect with humanity most is probably in commercially farmed fish. There are some that can cause damage to salmon stocks. There's others that will parasitize largemouth bass, carp, goldfish. One of these days, I want to go down to Devall's Bluff because that area of Arkansas is actually home to about 90% of the commercial goldfish supply. Little known fact about Arkansas, round in the Devall's Bluff to Brinkley metro area, we've got fish farms that produce humongous amounts of goldfish and also bait minnows. And I idly wonder what kind of parasite problems they have. I should call them sometime and find out. Anyway, these are either ectoparasites on the outside of the body, or they're endoparasites on body parts that are easily reached from the outside. So you'd find them in the bladder, rectum, gills in fish especially, eye sockets, of course, but they don't get deep into the gut. You don't get them in the circulatory system. You don't get them in the blood. Many of them are relatively harmless. Some of them can be pretty severe, and I'll show you an example of one in a bit. They feed on dead skin, live skin, mucus, and blood of the host. The life cycle is really simple. They lay eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae swim around till they find a new host. So much easier going there. And there's one that's a parasite on a type of flatfish, the sole. The attachment organs of these guys can be fairly complex. The mouth is over at the right, and there's a pair of anterior attachment organs, little sticky suckers, on either side of the mouth. They kind of blend in with the rest of the body. They're those lighter spots just above and below the midline. At the posterior side of the critter, which is over on the left, there's a large attachment organ called the haptor, and the shape and size of the haptor is very different in different species. Sometimes, but not always, there are some added hooks on the haptor for attachment. In this case, there's a pair of hamuli, which is Latin for a little hook, or anchors in this particular species. And you can see those pretty clearly, just attachment hooks on that circular thing on the worm's right. So there's a pair of attachment organs on either side of the mouth. Just inside the mouth, you can see it just a little bit back from the right-hand side is a muscular bulb, the pharynx, kind of like a muscular pipette bulb that sucks up blood and mucus and whatever into the gut. And That's one we'll talk about in a bit. That's a fish parasite. You can see the opisthaptor is large, and in this case, it has many marginal hooks. You can see marginal hooks there, looking like claws on the opisthaptor. At the opposite end of these worms, you can see the mouth, and on either side of the mouth, there's a bump. Those bumps are the anterior attachment organs. But this species, the head can actually freely move around and grub up mucus or whatever it's feeding on. And those anterior attachment organs are just temporary. That big hooked posterior haptor, or opisthaptor as it's called, is the main thing that enables these monogeneans to hang on. Okay, they're hermaphroditic. They lay eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae with tufts of cilia. They're called Onchomyricidium larvae. In the diagram on the left, you can see bands of cilia, and at the back end, you can see hooks on the opisthaptor. So even as larvae, they have those hooks. Hence the name Onchomyricidium. Oncho means a claw. That SEM picture is the Onchomyricidium larva of a species that's parasitic in African clawed frog bladders, because somebody has to be, right? You got it. If you didn't have parasites in clawed frog bladders, you couldn't have them in hippopotamus eye sockets, and it would be such a poorer world. There's another one from a frog bladder. This one's weird. The posterior end is on the right, and instead of having one single sucker, there are 6 little separate suckers. So no single sucker, but 6 separate suckers. Suddenly I'm channeling Dr. Seuss. This particular one just happens to have a very highly branched gut. Most of that branching stuff that you're seeing inside most of the body is actually gut branches. The mouth is, of course, over at the anterior end. Frog bladders, people tend not to be particularly concerned about. This is one that people are. And this is the one that you saw a SEM picture of a couple of slides ago, Gyrodactylus. This is one that's economically very significant as a pest of farmed fish. Goldfish will get it, trout, salmon, bluegills. The salmon species, Gyrodactylus salaris, a couple of years ago cost an estimated 500 million euros. That's more than $500 million. I can't do the conversion in my head, I'm afraid. But it cost the Norwegian farmed salmon industry quite a lot of money. Fish don't die from the worm itself, but they die from secondary infections. If that worm is grubbing up the protective layer of mucus on the skin, that can leave the skin open to infection. And then the puncture wounds caused by those hooks and anchors on the opisthaptor, you can see there's a pair of big hooks and then those marginal hooks down at the lower right. That does pretty wicked damage to the skin, and that can cause secondary infections of the wounds. So you're seeing the posterior end at the lower left, and the upper right is actually the head and prominent organs. The mouth is in between, but those 2 bumps at the upper right is attachment organs. I actually went looking for these one year. I went out and bought some farmed salmon fillets that still had the skin on. Did not successfully find them. One of these days I might give that another try. I have not been able to find this one at Kroger just yet, but you might have to get fresher fish than that, but we shall see. This is weird. because these guys skip the larval stage. They don't have oncomericidium. The embryos actually develop inside the body of the parent in a chamber called the egg cell formation region, which is basically a hollowed out ovary. And you're actually seeing this here. You might notice that the middle of this worm has just kind of a big oval area with something in it. That's embryos developing inside this worm. And apparently the embryos actually get nutrition from mom through the lining of the egg cell formation region. So if you thought that, mommy nurturing unborn babies inside her womb was unique to mammals, it's not. Scorpions do it, and so do Gyrodactylus monogeneans, which is really cool. And in fact, a worm can develop embryos while it's still an embryo. You can have up to 4 generations nested one inside the other. You actually get this in some other species as well. Certain mites will do this, where the females get impregnated by their brothers while they're all still inside mom. Yeah, mites, Pyomotus will do that. And so, yeah, the females will be pregnant and have embryos inside them while they're still inside their mother. That kind of extreme telescoping of the generations, I'm not sure, but this may be what makes Gyrodactylus so bad. It's the kind of thing that you see in organisms that reproduce extremely rapidly, organisms that are taking advantage of a resource that's not going to be around, will often have production, and sometimes that includes this kind of generational telescoping. So yeah, this is not the only critter that does that, where you'll have embryos that are already pregnant with the next generation. There was a recent study, we talked about this in context of the point of sexual reproduction. This was a study back 2 years ago looking at Gyrodactylus infecting wild guppies. These are what wild guppies looks like. They're native to northern South America and the Caribbean, Pasilia reticulata. Of course, fancy guppies have been bred that show, all kinds of fancy color patterns and fin shapes and things like that. These are males from the wild species that are not nearly so wild looking. They hybridized fish from 2 separate wild populations and infected the hybrid offspring with Gyrodactylus. And it turned out that guppies that had major histocompatibility alleles, those are the alleles for the genes that function in self and non-self recognition, the ones that had alleles that their Gyrodactylus had not encountered were better at resisting infection. The infection intensity actually went down. That blue line in the graph up there at the top, those are the guppies that were homozygous for MHC alleles that their Gyrodactylus had never seen before. And you can see they're better at shucking off the infection. They got infected, but they after about day 9, the numbers of worms per guppy dropped a lot more. So they were better able to fight off the infection. Whereas the fish that had MHC alleles that Gyrodactylus had encountered before didn't do as well. And that actually suggests that the Red Queen hypothesis is true, that genetic diversity is one way to resist parasites. If you give parasites alleles that they've never encountered before, they're not as good at infecting you. In a related study, they looked at inbred versus outbred guppies. And in red, that steepest red line is the number of parasites graphed against time in days over on the right. And you can see that their parasite loads are higher than deliberately outbred and control guppies. The outbred is the yellow line and the control is the blue. So that's another good reason for sexual reproduction. That's another reason to avoid inbreeding. The more genetically, sex generates genetic diversity, and the more genetically diverse a population is, the less likely a parasite's going to be able to gain a foothold. So there. Oh, and finally, lest you thought I was kidding, there's that hippo eye socket parasite. Actually found a paper on this by a couple of South Africans. There was a hippo herd that had gotten too large. And you need to be concerned about this because hippos are more dangerous to people than lions. They look adorable, but they'll kill you. And there was a herd that was large enough to be dangerous, and it had to be culled. So they went out and shot 15 hippos. And, if you've ever wondered what you would do with 15 hippos, the answer is dissect them and see if they've got worms up their eye sockets. And in fact, 90% of them did. And this is what they look like when they're alive. The white end is the end with the haptors at the rear. The red end has the gut, and it's full of hippopotamus eye socket blood. Last one. One place where you see monogeneans a lot is on fish gills. And this is one. This is a parasite of European carp called Diplozoon paradoxum. The larvae attach to fish gills, and if they never encounter another larva, they die. But if they do encounter another larva, the larvae will grow together, and their tissues and organs will fuse, and each one's sperm duct will cross over in such a way that it will lie right next to the other one's egg duct. So each one will cross-fertilize the other. Each one will fertilize the other one's eggs. There's a diagram of what that looks like. Over on the right, the lower right, you can see that that's the attachment organ, and it's actually got 8 little clamps in this particular species. The reproductive organs, the mouths are up at the very top, and most of the colorful parts that you see are reproductive organs, and they've crossed over in such a way that the testes of each one are fertilizing eggs in the ovary of the other. And larvae that don't encounter another larva will die and never reach sexual maturity. Diplozoon's the only animal that is absolutely known to be 100% monogamous, because the only way that they can reproduce is to find a mate, grow together, form that, two-headed, two-tailed thing, and fertilize each other's eggs. So I'll leave you with that. That was rather a lot to cover, but I hope it was reasonably interesting. And that puts us in, okay, yeah, I'm glad you like my choice of beverage. That puts us in good position to talk about tapeworms next week. So I'll stop the recording.